I've always believed that patience was one of life's great virtues. My father used to tell me that the best men are the ones who can keep their cool while the world around them is losing its head. For most of my life, I lived by that rule. I worked with my hands, raised a family, paid my taxes, and minded my own business. But patience, I've learned, only works when the other person has even a shred of respect. And respect was something that disappeared from my neighborhood the moment Karen's son moved back in. I live in a modest suburban cul-de-sac on the outskirts of town. My wife, Sarah, and I bought our house back in the late 90s. It wasn't big or fancy, but it had a yard where our kids could chase the dog, and a porch where we could sit in the evenings with a cold beer and talk about nothing. Over the years, we watched families come and go, lawns change hands, fences go up and come down. It was a peaceful life until Karen came along. Karen had been on the HOA board for years, but she only became president after old Mr. Delaney passed away. He was a good man, fair and level-headed. He ran things with common sense and kindness. Karen was the opposite. She treated the HOA like a kingdom and herself like the monarch. Rules weren't guidelines, they were weapons. She fined people for leaving their trash cans out a day too long, sent nasty emails about untrimmed hedges, and once, I kid you not, demanded a neighbor repaint his fence because a shade of white clashed with her hydrangeas. For the most part, I stayed out of it. I figured it wasn't worth fighting over nonsense. But then her son came back to live with her. Ryan was a tall, smug kid in his mid-20s. He strutted around like he owned the street, wearing designer clothes and a grin that told you he thought the world owed him something. Word around the neighborhood was that he'd flunked out of college twice, burned through a few of his mother's credit cards, and was now finding himself. For what I could see, finding himself meant sleeping till noon and revving his Porsche 911 loud enough to wake the whole block. The first time I saw that car parked in my assigned spot, I figured it was a mistake. Every homeowner in our little community had a numbered parking space. Ours was right in front of our house. I'd parked there for nearly 2 decades without a single issue. I wrote a polite note, placed it under his windshield wiper, and thought that would be the end of it. The next morning, the Porsche was there again, gleaming in the sunlight like it belonged on a magazine cover. My car, a dented old Ford I'd had since my last year working as a mechanic, sat down the street in the overflow area, baking in the sun. I sighed, took a deep breath, and decided to walk over and talk to Karen. She opened the door wearing a floral robe and that fake smile that always meant trouble. "Oh, hi, Mike," she chirped. "Lovely morning, isn't it?" "Morning, Karen." I said evenly, "Listen, your son's car is parked in my spot again. Could you ask him to move it?" Her smile faltered just slightly before returning full force. "Oh, that spot? He'll just be there a bit. He's running late. I'll tell him." But she didn't. The next day, same thing. The day after that, again. By the end of the week, I was parking halfway down the street like a visitor in my own neighborhood. When I finally caught Ryan one morning, he was standing by his car, polishing the hood like it was made of gold. I walked over and said, "Morning, son. That spot you're in belongs to me. Mind moving your car?" He turned, squinting like I was interrupting something important. Then he smiled. "Relax, man," he said, leaning against the car. "It's just a parking spot." "No," I said, keeping my voice calm. "It's my parking spot." He smirked. "You're retired, right? You're not going anywhere early. I'll be gone by the time you need it." And with that, he put on his sunglasses and walked away. That was the day my patience cracked a little. I went to the HOA meeting the following week, hoping to handle things the right way. I'd never been the type to stir the pot, but enough was enough. The meeting was held in the community center. Karen sat at the head of the table with her little nameplate, gavel, and binder full of rules. There were maybe 10 of us there. When it came time for open complaints, I raised my hand. "Yes, Mike," she asked sweetly. "It's about parking," I said. "Your son's been using my assigned space every morning for the last 2 weeks." She sighed dramatically, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We've already addressed that," she said. "No," I replied. "You haven't." "Well, perhaps you could. Park in the visitor section temporarily. she said, tapping her pen. We're a community, Mike. Let's show a little flexibility. I stared at her, realizing then that this wasn't about parking at all. It was about power, and she had no intention of giving an inch. After the meeting, a few neighbors patted my shoulder and said, "Hang in there." I could tell they meant well, but they were just as tired of her as I was. She fined old Mrs. Green $50 for having wind chimes. She told the Nelsons their Christmas lights were too bright. The woman was a tyrant with a clipboard. That night, my wife tried to calm me. Sarah's always been the gentle one. We've been married 42 years, and she's the only reason I didn't lose my temper more often in life. "Let it go," she said softly, sitting beside me on the couch. "You'll give yourself high blood pressure over that kid." "I can't just let it go," I said. "It's not the parking, it's the principle. We followed every rule, paid every due, kept our home spotless. And she treats everyone like we're beneath her." She gave me a look that said she understood, but didn't approve. "Just don't do anything you'll regret," she whispered before heading to bed. But by morning, the Porsche was there again. I stood at my window, sipping my coffee, staring at that car sitting proudly in my space. And for the first time in a long while, I felt that old stubbornness from my younger years stirring. I hadn't built a career fixing engines and solving problems just to let some spoiled brat park on my dignity. That's when I decided to remind Ryan and his mother what happens when you underestimate a man who knows his tools. For a week, I planned. I watched his patterns. He parked every morning between 6:45 and 7 o'clock, left around 8:30. I checked the HOA rules again, printed by Karen herself. The section on unauthorized vehicles clearly stated that cars parked in designated private spaces without permission could be towed at the homeowner's discretion. Perfect. The following Thursday, I called my old buddy Frank. He used to run a small towing business before retiring. "Still got your flatbed?" I asked. He laughed. "Of course. You planning to move something?" "Yeah," I said. "A Porsche." He laughed again, but when I explained, his chuckles turned into a knowing silence. "Karen's kid?" he asked. "You got it." "Say no more," he said. "I'll be there at 7 sharp." When morning came, Ryan parked at his usual spot, slammed the door, and strutted into his mother's house. I waited an hour, then called Frank. Within 15 minutes, his truck rolled up quiet as a whisper. Together, we hooked the Porsche up and winched it onto the flatbed. I had access to the HOA's maintenance lot from back when I volunteered to store equipment there. Nobody else had used that key in years. We parked the Porsche inside, locked the gate, and left. But I wasn't done. Over the next 2 days, I visited the lot and got to work. My hands, though older and slower than they used to be, still remembered every bolt and screw. I stripped that Porsche piece by piece, doors, wheels, seats, everything. The engine came out last. It was beautiful engineering, but it represented everything wrong with that kid, flashy, expensive, and hollow. By the time I was done, the once shiny car was reduced to a heap of metal. When Ryan realized his car was missing, he came running to my door, red-faced and furious. "You took my car," he shouted. "I towed a car parked illegally in my space," I said calmly. "My mother's the HOA president," he yelled. "Then she should know the bylaws," I said, holding up the printed copy. "Page 6, Section B." He threatened to call the police, and he did. When the officer arrived, he asked a few questions, looked over the paperwork, and shrugged. "He's right," the officer said. "It was an unauthorized vehicle. Nothing illegal here." Ryan stormed off cursing, and Karen showed up next, screeching about property damage and harassment. But when she tried to rally the HOA against me, something happened she didn't expect. The neighbor stood up. Mrs. Green, the one with the wind chimes, spoke first. "Karen," she said firmly, "you fined half this street for nonsense. You can't bend the rules for your own son." Others chimed in. The Nelsons brought up her constant harassment over Christmas decorations. The Carsons mentioned how she'd threatened to tow their RV even though it was parked legally. By the end of the meeting, there was a motion to remove her as president. The vote wasn't even close. Karen resigned in tears, and within a few weeks, she and her son moved out. The Porsche what was left of it. Ended up at a local trade school after I donated the parts. I told the students they could rebuild it if they wanted. Maybe they'd learn something from it about machines or maybe about humility. Life in the neighborhood changed after that. People started smiling again. We had cookouts without worrying about noise complaints. Kids rode bikes without getting yelled at for blocking driveways. Peace had returned. One afternoon, a few months later, I was washing my old Ford when my new neighbor, a young couple, waved from across the street. They'd bought Karen's old house. We heard about the Porsche story, the husband said with a grin. Legendary. I laughed. Don't believe everything you hear, I said, though I couldn't help but smile. That night, Sarah and I sat on the porch watching the sunset. The air was cool, the crickets were singing, and for the first time in a long while, I felt content. You know, she said softly, you could have just called a tow company. I know, I replied, but sometimes people only learn when they lose something they value more than their pride. She smiled. You've always been stubborn, she said lovingly. Maybe, I said, but at least now I get to park in my spot. We both laughed. I've thought a lot about that whole ordeal since then. I don't take pride in destroying someone's car, not really, but I do take pride in standing up for myself. Life's too short to let bullies, whether they're HOA presidents or spoiled kids, walk all over you. There's a difference between kindness and weakness. For years, I confused the two. These days, I still fix small engines in my shed, mostly for fun. The students from that trade school sometimes send me photos of their progress rebuilding that Porsche. One wrote to say they named it the Phoenix. I like that. It means something broken found a way to be useful again. Maybe that's the real lesson in all this. Sometimes destruction isn't cruel, it's cleansing. It clears out arrogance, ego, and entitlement, leaving room for humility and growth. And every morning, when I back my old Ford neatly into my parking space, I take a moment to look around at the quiet street I fought for. I breathe in, sip my coffee, and smile. Because peace, I've learned, doesn't come from avoiding conflict. It comes from having the courage to face it and the wisdom to finish it with dignity, even if it means turning a Porsche into scrap metal.